Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. If you can settle down, that's great. Thank you all for coming to our latest event in our Climate Change and Environmental Politics series. It's been a great success, and it's good to see so many faces here. Those of you in Poli-Sci 320, please don't forget to take those photos. Thank you very much. But right now, what I'm going to do is introduce my friend and colleague, Michael Goldsby, who received his PhD in philosophy of science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2013, which just happened to be the same year you started, right?
That is correct.
In the School of Politics, Philosophy and Public Affairs. He has written on issues in philosophy of biology, decision theory, scientific modelling, sustainable development and food, energy, water security, as well as, obviously, climate change. His current research interests focus on understanding how to extract and ground policy-relevant information from complex scientific models. And I wasn't going to put his little extra bit in the bio, but he did. He wanted me to mention that he was my favourite person, very true, and also that he would be willing to step up to be Speaker of the US House. But I have to say that unfortunately that job is apparently now taken. Please join me in welcoming Michael Goldsby.
That was very nice, especially including the optional bit. Wow, I recognize some faces out there. I don't recognize others. This is great. Thank you for all coming out. Today is a chilly day, so I appreciate it. The title of my talk is, as you can all read, is The Lethal Logic of Climate Denial. Why do I say it's the lethal logic? Well, I believe that climate change is a clear and present danger, probably one of the biggest challenges we are currently facing. And unfortunately, climate action has been stymied. Climate action has largely been stymied because we have lacked political will. Why do we lack political will? It turns out our political leaders have cover from climate deniers among their constituency. So they're not really necessarily going to be held accountable for this. So I've been thinking about science denial for a very long time. My major advisor, Elliot Sober, wrote a lot about those folks who deny, say, the theory of evolution in favor of intelligent design. I've also considered things like vaccine hesitancy. These are things that I'm interested in, and I've noticed some particular patterns. And I'd like to share them with you today, but this time specifically focused on climate change denial. I've written on this a couple of times, but I'd like to say a bit more. Let me go ahead and say climate change, I believe, is real. Let me take a quick poll. Who believes climate change is real? I have a suspicion I am preaching to the choir here. Okay, so climate change is real. The amount of scientific evidence is immense. This is a 10-year-old, 1/3 of the IPCC AR5. The thing is in, look at it, it's massive. The print is so small I can no longer read it with my naked eye. That's more of a comment on my age than the print size, but still, it is dense and chock full of information, and the AR6 has 9 to 10 years more evidence included in it. So the amount of scientific evidence is immense. In the before times, that's what I'd like to call it, in the before times, I actually thought, I wrote a piece or two on climate change denial, and I thought my career needs to shift gears a bit, because I actually thought what the next step would be is, okay, we think climate change is real, but we have other pressing problems to deal with, so it would be a priority issue. And then this happened. Just a few choice quotes from a former president. So it turned out what was good for my career is bad for the climate, but I can now still talk about climate change denial. To be fair, Donald Trump did walk back his first claim up there. He said it was a joke. But we all know that this is, or rather, it's elite signaling. So it's basically telling his constituency it is okay to deny climate change. So I want to say that there's a little of that going on. All right. Here's what I want to do. First, I want to define climate denial, because there is a lot, if you talk to folks who are deny particular facts about climate change, they might say things like, oh, I believe it's real, but I don't believe it's human caused. Or I believe it's real, but I don't think it's going to be a big problem. Or they may say something more likely, they'll say something like, it's not that I deny climate change, I'm just a skeptic. Okay? So what I want to do is I want to define climate denial in a way that we can talk about a large group of varied climate deniers. The second thing I want to do, I say myths about climate denial. Really what I want to say is I want to talk about some problematic theories that have been forwarded with respect to climate change denial. And I think there is some good evidence to suggest that those theories, many of which I've held at one point, and I suspect some of you might hold, there's some evidence mounting against it, either social science evidence, or in some cases I would argue that it may not be prudential or pragmatic, I say for my pragmatist friend up here, it may not be prudential or pragmatic to consider that theory. Then I'm going to take a brief interlude into the philosophy of science to explain why and how climate change deniers can actually deny climate science in a way that is not absolutely logically irrational. There is a logic to this climate denial. And I'm going to say, for those of you that have taken like a logic class with me, there might be valid reasoning to it, but it is not sound. I am not defending the logic of climate denial. I am actually going to point out how difficult it is to actually confront. Then I'm going to talk about a troubling argument and how it shapes climate denial. I actually believe this troubling argument is the root of why we have climate deniers. Finally, I'm going to wrap up, if I have time, with some hope or how to challenge climate denial a bit more effectively. All right, let's start off. Denialism versus skepticism. I bet all of you in this room would call somebody who denies the reality of climate change, you'd call them a climate denier. But they would probably more likely, they'd like to call themselves a climate skeptic. And there's a reason why. In the common vocabulary, denialism sounds bad. It sounds dogmatic and opposed to particular, say, evidence. Whereas skeptic sounds like, look, I'm considering the evidence fairly and impartially, I just haven't been convinced. Now, I'm going to talk about it in the sense that philosophers talk about it. Philosophers use denial and skepticism, or epistemologists more precisely, like what I am. We talk about it as a doxastic attitude. That's a fancy word that we philosophers like to use, talking about belief states. Okay? So with a particular claim, I can believe it, okay? Or I could deny it, or I could suspend judgment. Suspending judgment is not necessarily a bad thing for some things, right? When we don't have enough evidence for that thing. Now, I want to say, none of those views is privileged as being more rational than another globally, okay? Obviously, if you believe that right now there are dragons about here, about to threaten my life, there is a sense in which you are irrational, okay, if you believe a dragon is in this room. I likewise think it is rational to deny that there is a dragon in this room, all right? I'm not sure that it would be rational of you to be skeptical that I'm sitting here talking to you today, okay? If you did that, please seek some help, all right? So, denialism, skepticism, I'm not using these as charged words like is commonly used in the vernacular. All right. start off with what is climate denial. But to start with that, I'm going to talk about what you folks, because everybody raised their hand. Nobody didn't raise their hand. So everybody raised their hand here. These are basically claims that you believe. You believe the global mean surface temperature is increasing and will continue to do so without intervention, largely as a result of more carbon in our atmosphere. You also believe that one of the causes, or the cause, of the rise of carbon and therefore the rise of global mean surface temperature is human activity. You also believe, I take it, that if the GMST, the global mean surface temperature, reaches a certain level, it will be bad. It will challenge food, energy, water security, among other things, and that is bad. It could be as bad as like Fallout 4 for those of you who play video games. All right. The point that I'd really like to make, and this is also important, we also know it's probably going to hurt the poor and the future generations disproportionately. So since I'm moderately affluent and getting old, it's not going to hurt me as much as struggling college students. All right. Now, what is climate denial? Well, climate denial is just simply the claim that CC1 through CC3 is not scientifically justified. So this way I can capture skeptics and deniers in this respect. And I can capture the wide range, okay? If someone's just denying anthropogenic climate change, I can still address that and talk about them. Okay, so I've given an abstract and I think a fairly unified account of what climate denial is. All right, why do folks deny climate change? Climate deniers, one thing that I often hear, and this is almost like the progression of a cocktail party with my climate science friends, right? We start out with the climate deniers don't have all the facts. That's the biggest one, the one that we go to first and foremost. And as a matter of fact, we like this one because it's got a fairly easy solution. The easy solution is we got to go out there and start communicating better with the public. We've got to either improve our communication style or get a big megaphone and just start preaching at the corner. Okay. There's a problem with this theory. Here's the problem. And I'm going to set up this graph. I cut out part of it. I apologize. If you take climate deniers and you give them a true-false sort of test, and you say climate change is the result of more CO2 in the atmosphere, what they will probably put down more often than not is false. Right? That's exactly what we'd expect from a climate denier. However, what that gets to is just the opinion that they're already committed to. What we want to test is we want to test to see if they have the facts available. And one way to test to see if they have the facts available, and it was done by Dan Kahan, is you actually come up with a set of true-false questions. And they're really clever true-false questions. Ones that you can't just go and say true every time it seems like climate change does something bad. They have a question on there like climate change causes cancer. It turns out no climate scientist has said that exactly. Okay. There's also the Arctic ice sheet, not the Antarctic ice sheet, but the Arctic ice sheet. Already the volume's displaced on a good portion of that, so if it melts, it really isn't going to change sea levels. But the Antarctic ice sheet is going to go into the ocean, and it will raise sea levels. And Greenland's ice sheet, and a bunch of others. So I'm looking at Kent Keller right now, making sure I say accurate stuff. So you give them a test instead, and you say, climate scientists say climate change is the result of increasing CO2 in the atmosphere. And it turns out the folks who thought human caused versus naturally caused, aka they're a type of denier, and no warming, no statistically significant difference on their performance on that test. What this says to me is they've heard the climate scientists, they've got that information, and they say, I hear what you're selling, but I'm not buying. So this is a problem, I think, for gap model, what I'll call gap model 1.0, because there's gap model 2.0. Gap model 2.0 is something to the effect of, well, okay, maybe they do have the facts, but they don't know how to interpret them. They don't have a sophisticated understanding of science, perhaps probabilistic thinking, especially since most of the predictions provided by climate scientists, including the IPCC, are grounded in probabilistic claims. Okay? And that could be a problem, and I understand this notion because it's sort of like wishful thinking on the part of climate deniers. There's a 95% likelihood things will go badly. You go, so there's still a chance it can go well. All right? And that's the sort of thought here, among other things. And if that were the case, you would expect, as you get more scientific sophistication, it would be more like the graph on the left. That you'd actually, by the way, I should mention that Dan Kahan did notice, of course, and I don't suspect this will be a surprise to anyone in the room, that right-leaning folks tend to deny climate change more than left-leaning folks. All right? So that's the reason he has the left-right there. It corresponds to American political parties fairly well. But the reality is, people with more sophisticated scientific understanding tend to actually increase their denial of climate change. Now, my friend and colleague Matt Slater, as part of this climate series, he came up and he said, well, this is a fact-based sort of metric that they're using to determine scientific sophistication, and really what he says is what they need to know is more about the process of science to make it more transparent, to know that it is sometimes messy, not perfect, but probably our best bet for making our decisions. And he basically is saying more philosophy of science needs to be taught, and as a philosopher of science, I couldn't agree with him more. Okay? But I'm not convinced yet that that gap model 2.0 is good. Finally, it's all political. There's a good reason for that too, right? That graph. That graph seems to suggest, and in fact, Dan Kahan is the one who did all this research on climate change denial. And he is the one who basically, his view was, it's all about your political tribe. Okay? And if you go that way, you could say it's all political. Now, my argument against this is not going, I have no evidence in favor of this particular view. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer a prudential argument, a pragmatic argument. And it's based on the Biden-Mansfield maxim. It's actually, I heard it from Biden first, but Biden attributes it to, oh God, I didn't put his name. Do you know his, never mind. Mike Mansfield, thank you. He was a majority leader in the Senate when Joe Biden first started out. And basically, I paraphrase it, it's okay to question another's judgment, but don't question their motives, is basically the idea. And this is how Biden basically thought that he could go in with strong principles and still work with folks on the other side of the aisle. He didn't try to think of people as bad people if they're on the other side of the aisle. Okay? He elaborates. I love this elaboration, and this was done in a graduation speech at Yale University. He elaborates, because, I can actually read that better, because when you question a man's motive, when you say they're acting out of greed, or they're in the pocket of an interest group, etc., it's awful hard to reach consensus. What happens is you're already dismissing the other side. And when you dismiss the other side, what that's going to do is that's going to entrench them in their position. If you're not going to listen to them, it's just going to entrench them. If you're going to write off everything they're doing as politically motivated, they're going to write you off as well. And in fact, they've had some elite signaling such that they can do the same. Our former president actually said, basically, global climate change is a money-making conspiracy. All right? So, I argue, going to the political first, it encourages you to be dismissive, and it encourages them to be likewise dismissive, and it doesn't do much good. All right, I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to talk about my true academic love, philosophy of science. All right, so I'm going to give a naive and oversimplified version of the scientific process, one that is called falsificationism. I'm going to go ahead and say this is oversimplified, although most scientists still believe it's something like the core of what they do with respect to testing. Okay, and the basic idea is, if you have a hypothesis H, and I'm a logician, so I love putting the letters up there instead of the full word. If I have a hypothesis H, and if it's true, then I should expect that some observation O will occur. In other words, my theory is going to make a prediction. If O is true, according to Popper, lather, rinse, repeat for a new O. In other words, what he would say is what you've done is corroborated the theory. You haven't confirmed it. I'm okay calling it confirmed. But he says you corroborate the theory and you keep doing that until you falsify it. However, this is the key. If that prediction doesn't work out, we look for that observation out in the world and we can't find it, or we find out it is false, then what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to reject the theory and come up with a new theory. Okay. This is an overly simplified version of Popper. If you ever have the time, although I don't suspect you do, pick up his Logic of Scientific Discovery. It's a bit more nuanced and sophisticated than I'm providing now. I just told you to pick up a little LSD. I just want to make that clear. All right. Enter these two. Duhem actually happened before Popper. This is why Popper was aware of this, and then Quine happened after Popper. This is the Duhem-Quine thesis, and the thesis basically says a hypothesis by itself can't actually make a testable prediction. Instead, what's needed is a variety of auxiliary assumptions, and in climate change it's stuff like, what are we measuring when we're using satellite telemetry data, or something like that, satellite sensing data. I said telemetry, that was wrong. That just sounds cool, okay? What are we, another thing is, what's the carbon sensitivity? For example, how much, when we get a particular level of carbon, how much carbon does it take to sort of double? Every time we double our carbon load, how much does it increase our temperatures? Okay, everybody knows, even the denier scientists, and I've looked at more sophisticated deniers. Everybody agrees carbon raises temperature. They just push back on things like carbon sensitivity. The problem is I need those assumptions, but once I get them, then I get the prediction. I look for the observation. You know, warmer summers, more heat domes. That's the word that we should be using, more heat domes. And when I find they're true, I lather, rinse, repeat, and try to find more testable predictions. I call this the Duhem-Quine thesis, which is just simply a hypothesis by itself can't make predictions. There's the Duhem-Quine problem. And the Duhem-Quine problem, for my scientist friends in the room, this is just what we call controlling for confounding variables and questioning assumptions. Okay? You probably have never known it as the Duhem-Quine problem. But the problem is, instead of being able to reject H, I have to reject H or one of the many assumptions I've made. That's the issue. And the interesting bit is, just seeing that my prediction is false tells me something went wrong. It just doesn't tell me where. And in the past, like with Newtonian mechanics, we discovered the planet of Neptune because a particular planet, I'm not going to say the name because it's hilarious when I do, it started having wiggles that we wouldn't have expected to see. And Newtonian theory couldn't account for it. So what did we do? We didn't reject Newtonian theory. We rejected the assumption that there were only 7 planets. And it turns out we were right. However, we tried that same trick when we noticed that Mercury was behaving a little oddly. There's something called the advance of the perihelion of Mercury. If you want to talk to me about it, come to my office hours. But basically, we tried to pull that same trick with that. Didn't work out. We had to get rid of Newtonian mechanics, and we had to go to the general theory of relativity. Okay. So the issue is, in the case, one of those cases, it was right to reject the assumption, and in another case, it was right to reject the hypothesis. How do you tell? Duhem said you had to develop good sense. Okay? And I'm going to go ahead and say practicing scientists kind of get a good judgment about this, and the scientific community in general, with things like peer review, help us work through that. Okay? By the way, Duhem had very poor sense. He actually wanted to reject the general theory of relativity as Germanic barbaric science. Bizarre. But Quine, on the other hand, he said, no, you're always testing not just a theory, but an entire epistemic matrix of the hypothesis plus all the auxiliary assumptions. And he made the claim that you could hold onto a theory come what may, despite it, if you were willing to make enough changes in your auxiliary assumptions. Now, of course, once again, he didn't say that's what you ought to do. He says that's what you could do. Okay? Now, interestingly enough, he was a holist, and he also believed something like peer review would wash stuff out. He was a naturalized philosopher. All right, why do I bring this up? Let's treat denial, climate change denial, as a scientific theory. Now, I mean, that might trouble some of you that I'm calling climate change denial a scientific theory, but let's treat it like a theory, okay? It's a hypothesis. It makes certain predictions. Maybe one of the predictions is we're not going to have more hot summers. We're not going to have more heat domes. We're not going to have water shortages. And of course, when you point this out to a climate denier, they say, oh yeah, okay, I can explain this, all right? They basically start changing some auxiliary assumptions, okay? It turns into whack-a-mole? I'm hungry, maybe I need some guacamole. It turns into whack-a-mole, right? Has anybody had that experience with a climate change denying friend or family member? Where it's like every time you try to bring something, it also is same with conspiracy theories, for example. It works the exact same way. No matter what, you're just playing whack-a-mole all day if you try to actually say, this fact seems inconsistent. Well, it turns out consistency is a minimum standard for rationality, but it's a low bar. You can actually maintain consistency fairly well by adjusting your auxiliary assumptions. At some point, you might get pinned in a corner, but that's okay. All right? So, with that in mind, let me talk about a troubling argument. Here I have coal workers, and I have workers at the back in oil field. They're clearly in the fossil fuel industry. These folks, they might run through something like this argument, say, maybe not precisely and as systematically as we are today, but they're going to look at it and they're going to say if CC1 and CC3 are true, then climate change will hurt the poor, future generations, and the environment. Now, you might be tempted to say, that's okay, because they don't care about the future generations or the poor or the environment. But it turns out there's a lot of empirical evidence that no matter which side of the aisle you are on, that you do care about. Nobody wants to hurt the poor. Nobody wants to hurt future generations. Nobody wants to hurt the environment. I mean, yes, some politicians' policies, nobody's gotten elected on a platform going, I've given this serious consideration, and you know what? I think I'd like to screw over the poor and maybe future generations. No one's going to get elected that way, okay? But what happens is if they want to do something like that, they'll make up something to say that the folks that they're actually going to hurt are not really poor. This is welfare queens, for example. This was a myth that there were folks on welfare that were driving BMWs and eating lobster every day. So misinformation can get in there. So what I want to say is this is a value that we all hold. unless you're sociopathic, okay? We all hold this value. If CC2 is true, then some parts of my lifestyle, this is what these folks are saying because they're contributing to the fossil fuel industry. Some part of my lifestyle some parts are contributing to hurting the poor future generations and the environment, right? That seems to follow. Only true villains would hurt the poor future generations or the environment. I'm not a true villain. Look at him. I mean, there is evil in the world. I thought about throwing, when I got to this point, throwing out some pictures of candidate evil. Okay, but I thought that might be going too far. There's evil in the world, but these folks aren't the villains, right? Nor is my lifestyle indicative of villainy, because if it were, then I'd be a true villain. Therefore, the only option here is one of CC 1 through 3 must be false. In other words, I'm arguing from the point that I'm not a true villain. Interestingly enough, here, let me do another quick poll. How many of you eat meat at least once a day? How many of you drive low MPG cars? Okay, yeah. How many of you have taken more than one vacation by airplane in a year? Well, okay. Implicit climate change denial is what I'm going to suggest. Okay? The thing is you can run through this argument. And what you're going to do is you're going to get to the bottom and you're going to say, then, since I'm not a true villain, my lifestyle isn't contributing to climate change. This is how we make ourselves feel better. Okay. By the way, full disclosure, I'm what is called a chegan. I'm a vegan who cheats. Okay. But I got to go ahead and say, if we all went down to like weekday vegetarianism, that would make a huge dent in climate change. It really would. But am I going to call you, all those folks who raised your hands, I didn't do that to shame you. Am I going to call you a villain? Are you villains? Are you on like Putin level villainy? No, you're not. Okay? Could you be better? Yeah. Could I be better? Yes. I could be a lot better. I think the problem with this is one premise, that one. This is what if you were my philosophy class, I'd say, what's the problematic premise? And that's the problematic premise. Only true villains hurt the poor future generations or the environment. I myself, I could probably give more to Oxfam. I'm not as good as I could be. There's lots of things I could do, but I don't do them yet. Am I a true villain? No. Could I be better? Of course. Now the problem with this, and this is where I'm going to go, this I think is driving climate change denial because believe it or not, it drives a minor climate change denial with all of you. Okay? The problem is we're vilifying those folks. And when you vilify them, they're going to double down on this argument. And they're going to become more entrenched. So this is my tips for confronting denial. One, don't cast your interlocutor as a villain. I don't care if they didn't vote for your guy in whatever election. Don't cast them as the villain because it only encourages them to entrench given the troubling argument. Remember the Mansfield-Biden maxim. If you start dismissing them as just politically motivated or not understanding because they're on the other side of the aisle, you're going to further entrench them. If you start doubting that they really care about the poor, the future, and the environment, accusing them of motive actually encourages them to do the same to you, as we've discovered earlier. This is what I think. I mean, if you have loved ones that are, say, climate change skeptics, I suggest those first two steps. Now, if you do have a recalcitrant one, and this is where I'd like to go back to some cool philosophy of science. It turns out, regardless of what happens, someone who is a committed climate change denier, it's not real hard for them to actually come up with ways to adjust their auxiliary assumptions so that they can meet every challenge you provide them. But as Popper pointed out, that's more of a weakness than a strength. It's actually it's a bad weakness, because here's the thing. If I'm a climate change denier and I can accommodate retreating glaciers, rising sea levels, hotter summers, if I can accommodate all those, what prediction am I going to make? You ask those of us in the room, what do we say is going to happen? Glaciers are going to retreat. Sea levels are going to rise. And by the way, if we're wrong, we're happy to talk about that and start adjusting our theory, not our assumptions. That's the responsible way to handle it. And here's the thing. What happens is the climate change denier, ask them if the glaciers will retreat or advance. They'll go, I don't know. But my theory can accommodate both. So they're actually in a tough spot. And here's the issue. Why do we care about science with respect to climate change? Well, one reason is, and this is the way I'd like to put it, if I'm going to bet even money, I'm going to bet on scientific claims every time. They're going to get it wrong occasionally, and that's okay. But in the long run, I'm going to make money. When I'm making policy decisions, I should be betting on what science says. But if the science tells me the glaciers are going to retreat or they're going to advance, I don't have any policy relevant information to use. What do I do in that case? I don't know. So, I want to say that's the thing that's troubling about climate denial. And that's the reason I'm encouraging you to consider your interlocutors with a little more, say, empathy and compassion. All right, that's all I've got. I have a bunch of reading there. Do what you'd like.
We've got about 20 minutes for questions.
20 minutes? Oh man, I was going to make it 10.
So I'll start off. We talked a little bit in class. One of the common themes that comes up with the speakers here have been, how do you deal with Uncle Ted around the Thanksgiving table? It's always Uncle Ted. I don't know why, but Uncle Ted. What would you suggest, given what you're proposing here, how can you reach them out? Jason Vogel, for example, suggested you reach out with love. You just say, if you loved me, you would also believe what I believe and change your behavior. And that seems a little easy. What do you think?
I actually am a little worried about if you love me, putting conditions on love. If you love me, then you'll believe what I believe. If I tried that with my wife, I'd be in trouble. So I'm a little worried about that particular claim. Okay, even though my wife and I agree on like most everything. I want to make that clear. We have a good marriage. Actually, no. Understanding is better. I think it's good to go up and say, hey, look, I know you're not a bad person. I know you don't intend to hurt. This is the reason I'm saying, I know you don't intend to hurt the poor future generations. I know you're just trying to make a living. I could be better in certain ways, and I ask them, in what ways could I be better? Here's some ways that you could be better with respect to climate change. And I have my dad, for all it's worth, he voted for the former president. He voted for Matt Gaetz, because Matt Gaetz is actually the representative of where he lives. Okay? But I've got my dad to admit to particular climate actions just by chatting with him. We still don't agree politically, nor will we ever, barring head trauma on one of our parts. That's a great question. Yeah, Susan.
Okay, so I guess my question, and it's not going to be well articulated because it's still bouncing around.
That's good, because then I can answer anything.
So, taking what all you've done, so WSU Extension, Washington State's the land-grant university, and they've taken up a program called Resilient Washington that's looking at a variety of areas, but one of them is climate change. And the discussion on that level has been, not everybody with extension offices across the state can use the term climate change, and because their funding is dependent on counties, And so there's been that discussion. Do we still use that language? So I guess my first part is, what would you recommend for like extension offices who want to do this work in these areas where denial is high? How would you approach it if you were them, changing the language? And also, what is the role of Washington State University as a land-grant university in addressing this issue of climate change across the state, as they're taking up more and more?
I'm going to answer the second question first.
Okay.
Because the first question is actually, okay. The second question, I think we got to stand out in front. We've got to be leaders with respect to climate change action and climate change truth. I've been lucky to be a part of resilience teams that look for developing food, energy, water security in the face of a climate change, changing climate in the Columbia River Basin. And we got to get out there and we got to actually address real problems. And unfortunately, when I started looking at climate change many years ago, we thought we could solve everything through mitigation. Now, and then a few years later, we're like, oh, we're going to have to mitigate and adapt. Now we're going to have to mitigate, adapt, and bioengineer. Or now the geoengineer, sorry. Maybe bioengineer too. So we should be out in front. And and unfortunately, it's not going to make us friends all the time. I'm going to go ahead and say our state representatives are probably not going to be thrilled with us. But they're also not going to push us too far because we're still one of the major employers in their area. So that's where I think we should be. And that's the reason I feel like it's all hands on deck. I'm a philosopher of science. I'm not out there doing climate science. But I think climate change is so damned important, I'm throwing my particular skills into the mix. So I think that's what we should do as a land-grant institution. Now your other question, here's my kind of quick answer. I'd call up my friend Susan Horde and say, how would I best go about dealing with these issues? Because you'd give me a lot of good information. The second, but I do think there is a way, and this does tie in a little bit to what I'm saying. Why don't we start focusing on the problems they see? We don't have to, we can continually say, look, we're facing climate change. There's a couple of ways we can adapt. There's a couple of ways we can reduce the risk. And those things are the things we ought to be pursuing. We don't have to use the C word if they don't want to hear it. We can still, actually, I hate to say it, that's sort of how I got my dad where I was going. Because I was like, look, you knew my grandmother, she cared about the environment. You do too, right? Yeah, okay. Well then, maybe you can have one less piece of bacon, Dad, every breakfast. For a variety of reasons. Okay? So I think that's the way to go. And yeah.
The Congress subsidizes the fossil fuel industry by about $20 billion each year. $200 million of that comes back as electoral funding for people to select the politicians who will maintain that gravy train. That flies in the face of what you're saying with the Biden initiative, but it is a real motivator to drive the conversation in the opposite direction. So how can we have this? Should we not consider these issues that are real positive or real powerful drivers of financial misconduct?
Yeah, no. Let me go ahead and say, Oreskes and Conway had a beautiful book called Merchants of Doubt, among other things. And I am not denying that there are merchants of doubt and there are bad actors in political and corporate arenas, okay, on almost every issue. I'm not denying that for a second. But this is what I'm saying. Am I going after those folks? Am I saying that you should be, say, going to, what is his name, Mike Johnson? Should you actually get an appointment with Mike Johnson and sit down and go, Mike, I know you're a good person, but...
I love you.
Yeah, I love you. Let's hug it out, man. I don't think that's going to work. But the thing is, Mike Johnson has cover, political cover, because his constituency denies climate change. So I'm not actually saying, no, don't go ahead and call out corporations and elites that are involved in this. Okay. Although I wouldn't use that worry when I'm talking to, say, their constituents who you're trying to convince that climate change is real. I'm saying my talk is targeted to the constituency that is actually providing cover for those bad actors in those areas.
What I hear Simon saying is, given Citizens United, is what you've been describing going to do us any good? Because politics, especially at the national level, is so bought and paid for.
It is bought and paid for, but really, if you look at the folks who deny climate change, Mike Johnson, he's in Louisiana oil territory. It's his constituents that are giving him the cover there. I'm still going to maintain that that's what's given him the cover, is because his constituents are the ones that are working on those oil fields, and their livelihood is tied up in that oil. I hate to say it, we're almost to the point where we need to bribe fossil fuel industries to get them out of the frickin' game. I'm almost to that point. Not quite, but almost to that point. And that's the thing that I'm saying, is Citizens United being what it is, they can do it, but who really is influenced by political advertisements? Okay, some of you actually are a little, okay? But for the most part, you're fairly savvy on all the things that Citizens United can actually spend on. You're actually influenced by what's on the ground. The constituency is still driving this in a lot of ways. So I'm going to say, if you really want, I mean, yeah, you can rail against that. And in fact, the good fight is to fight against that. But another good fight that every one of us in this room can do is to actually talk to those climate deniers and treat them as people. That's the claim I'm making. So it's, once again, it's a prudential argument, not an epistemic argument against the it's all political claim. Oh, good God, Tyler. Former student.
Well, some might say you're a pretty good philosopher. And I feel like most of your presentation is more based on like scientific facts and theories. So what would maybe be your philosophical facts and theories on like generally like climate denialism or just generally scientific denialism?
Oh, here. Well, first of all, if you think I gathered any of this fucking I didn't, okay? Didn't gather any data, so that almost disqualifies me for being a scientist, okay? It's kind of weird to say, for example, the scientists don't do any philosophical work, because they do. They do theorizing, they've got to do some conceptual work, etc. So they actually, drawing that line between philosophy and science, it's like one of the first things I have my philosophy of science class try to do. And it's really hard, actually. Does this mean as a philosopher I don't use data? It'd be dumb if I have empirical data and I go, yep, that's wrong. My philosophical stance depends upon observations carefully and systematically gathered being wrong. Okay? So I'd be a fool. So this whole thing to me is my philosophical view. My philosophical view is, and it's more of a study of the logic. I think a lot of people, and what I really want to push here, is one of the biggest narratives that comes out is that person's a climate change denier and they're an idiot. With my dad, maybe that's true. Okay? Don't tell him I said that. Once again, treat with respect. Okay? But the thing is, the pure logic of it is actually still valid, just not sound. And so you took, the only philosophy class you took with me was logic, where we just talked about validity. But the soundness is another important part, right? We got to know whether these premises are true, whether their auxiliary assumptions are actually reasonable to hold. And that's the logic that I'm pushing on. Okay. There's also a cool thing called the knowledge to action principle, which says if you know a thing, say you know climate change is real, and you know that if it's real, then a certain action is the best action to take, then you only will know that thing if you're willing to take that action. Say, reducing your carbon footprint. Oops. Okay. It turns out we may have a lot more climate deniers than you think. Interestingly enough. Maybe that's what I'm going to say. Maybe it's more of a spectrum. All of us deny something about climate. If you, by the way, for the one climate ascetic in this room, thank you for the hard work you're doing. Okay. The rest of us still have some room for improvement. Davin? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Davin.
When we're talking about talking to people, trying to change people's minds, let's say, even if we are very good at, going through this, it's not really an algorithm, but using kind of these tips, and let's say we are able to successfully change someone's mind, how do we get there if they won't even talk to us in the first place?
Yeah, if they don't talk to us in the first place, that's a huge problem. And actually, I love this one because notice that far picture, you can't really see it, but it's got a lot of social media crap hanging on it. And a lot of folks think we're actually, we talk with other folks on social media. We don't. So I'm going to plug another talk that I'm giving, which is How Beer Might Save Democracy. Okay, what you want to do is you want to actually get it into more of a non-threatening situation, unfortunately. You got to really talk to them. You got to go in with a little humility and be ready to be wrong. That's hard. Being ready to be wrong. Unfortunately, I don't think we have enough of that. What I like is there is a philosopher, Nelson Goodman, but John Rawls took up the maxim, which is reflective equilibrium. Talking with folks, going in with your theory ready to go, is a good thing, and you have certain intuitions about what's right and what's wrong. Problem is, you might talk to somebody, and it may turn out your intuitions are misguided, and maybe even hurting that other person. So you got to be ready to either reject your intuitions or adjust your theory. When you're actually, if I'm going to expect that of my interlocutors with respect to climate change denial, I kind of got to go in with it myself as well, right? So I'd say you have to go into a conversation, and it's got to be a conversation where you're not preaching, where you're not accusing. Big one. I mean, don't. If you do get an appointment with Mike Johnson, go nuts. But everybody else, I think we ought to take it. I can't believe I am bagging on the speaker in the speaker's reading room. Oh well. You got to take steps. You got to be disarming. You got to go in with an open mind because that's what you expect from them. Otherwise, you're not talking. Right? You're yelling at each other. Yeah.
So the pattern that people use in denial is very similar to the fascist playbook of identifying others, having a mythological past, and then saying that if we can just get rid of these climate activists, everything will be fine. They're using the same dynamic in other areas of conversation. So isn't the overarching problem one of fascist projections?
Well, one of the ways fascists do get in power is they start looking for discontent among a particular constituency. Right. What I'm suggesting here is to undermine that, to actually go after the constituency and try to actually go after those hearts and minds. Is there a fascist playbook? I'm going to go ahead and say I bought into the Biden-Mansfield maxim. And I'm trying my best to avoid attributing particular political motivations and political playbooks to folks. I think it's not helpful for conversations. Right. I'm just saying that. I get the worry, though. because I'm just as worried about the rise of a particular level of populism in this country and how it is actually trying to go after a particular discontented demographic within the country and trying to pit it against another disaffected and discontented demographic in this country. And to me, that does look like a playbook, and I'm worried about that. And one thing that I'd like to do is say, instead of actually going in with a political agenda, go in and have a beer with the constituency, undermine that. If each of you take 2 friends and do that too, and then they take 2 friends. Okay, now that's silly. But I get the worry. And I'm not denying the worry at all. I'm just saying I'm not sure that that's where my talents lie, nor the talents of anybody in this room lie to deal with that particular issue.
I'm agreeing about the business of not focusing on the people. I was actually focusing on the process.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm gonna. Here's where really what I'd like to do, because I'm neither a political scientist nor a political philosopher. I'd like to punt to many of my esteemed political science colleagues with respect to that, is actually where I'd like to go.
I think we've got time for one more question. I think we should run just 2.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have gone right back to you. Sorry, Danny.
Okay.
You can ask me later.
Sorry, no. Hey, so this is maybe a little bit on a tangent, but I think one of the things that I've always thought is there's a lot of people that do agree that climate change is happening, but they cannot conceive that it's human caused, and they can easily say we've had climate change. You can look back in history and it's happened before and it's going to happen again, and the idea that humans can actually cause an effect on the climate, unintentionally, is something they can't right. But if you explain things like you talk about evolution, how we can take a plant, genetically modify it and change it in a lab overnight, which was something that used to take 10,000 years, they can understand that and believe that, but just the concept of an unintentional human-caused activity, and I'm just wondering why that isn't kind of a key into getting into some of the thinking.
So let me go ahead and say, I'm not quite as sanguine about evolutionary theory and its acceptance. There are still folks that will deny the theory of evolution despite the evidence that you've provided. There's an interesting argument, and since you talked about the theory of evolution, and that's usually religiously driven, there's an interesting argument that says, there is a weird denial group that says climate change is happening, climate change is bad, but it's not human caused, and it can't be human caused because humans cannot do anything without God's will, for example. Interestingly enough, they might even think that it's part of the coming apocalypse that will lead them to the final days and everything like that. And I don't
Even
know.
if there's not a religious aspect to it, there's still a historical, climate variations.
Here's the thing. I want to say it to all my climate scientist friends and all my biologist friends, etc. The information is already out there, as suggested by Dan Collins' thing. Now, why haven't they grasped it? And in some ways, it's hard for them to imagine that we humans can do anything. And there's this sort of silly it's almost called the fallacy of division or the fallacy of composition. I can't remember what it is. Certainly me by myself, even if I eat meat every day, I am a drop in the bucket. If everybody else, changed their lifestyles to more of a climate ascetic lifestyle and I maintain a very large climate footprint, I'm not going to change it. But it is hard for people to realize that in aggregate, and there's something of a fallacy. And that's something that I think is not bad to bring up, because I think that little connection of understanding is sometimes lost, give or take a few areas where it's religiously based.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. Please join me in thanking Michael Goldsby for a great